All right, let's talk about severability and competence under US law. This is part of arbitration law. What we're trying to do is protect the arbitration proceeding from giving up its power in the ever ongoing fight with other dispute resolution outlets like the courts. So what severability and competence both do is protect the arbitration proceeding itself and the integrity of its power to decide a dispute. Let's talk about first what both concepts mean, and then go into how they interact and how the law is looking on the US side of things. Severability means that when we look at a contract, that the arbitration agreement is generally judged by itself. So when a question arises as to the validity of a contract, that usually does not seep through to the arbitration agreement, meaning that when we judge the validity of an arbitration agreement, we have to focus on the arbitration agreement itself. That grows from the idea that the arbitration agreement is really almost like its own contract, and that it is severable from the underlying container agreement. Competence is the power of an arbitration panel to decide on its own jurisdiction. All right, US law. Arbitration agreements in the US, most of them, are governed by the FAA, the Federal Arbitration Act, enacted in the 20s of the last century. The FAA has a strong underlying policy favoring arbitration. And in the past 100 years, that policy has led to plenty of court decisions that support arbitration and granted somewhat of a primacy as long as that is contracted for. So the FAA puts high relevance on the party's agreement and the party's intent. And usually arbitration agreements are valid, enforceable, and are enforced to their terms under the FAA policy in the US. All right, talking a little bit about competence first. In the US, that is really more known as arbitrability, and that's a broad term. What falls under this can be the scope of the arbitration agreement, whether a dispute falls into that scope. It can be the validity and the decision over the validity of an arbitration agreement. And usually the rule in the US is, the default rule is, this decision remains with the court. That means that when a party brings a dispute to a court for it to decide it, the court will generally be the entity that looks to arbitrability and whether an arbitration agreement as part of a contract will be enforced, and the dispute on the merits will be sent to arbitration. Now, this can be overcome by an agreement by the parties. This was first the current test applicable in the United States was set by the AT&T decision in 1985. That decision held that by clear and unmistakable showing of the intent of the parties, that a dispute or an issue is to be submitted to the arbitration panel, and then the court will not decide this issue, and the issue becomes arbitrable. So it needs this showing of clear and unmistakable intent, which goes back to the underlying FAA idea of giving full effect to the agreement of the parties. All right, so the next step is severability. When we look at severability, where it really becomes important is when the validity of a contract is attacked by a party. And as I said, severability kind of splits up the contract in the underlying contract, the container agreement, and the arbitration agreement. The rule here is, and this was first decided in Prima Paint, a Supreme Court decision in the US from 1967. The rule is, if the party attacking the validity is not attacking specifically the arbitration agreement itself, then this dispute as to the validity of the contract, maybe fraud, that may be unconscionability, is submitted to the arbitrators. So to keep a dispute from the arbitrators, what needs to happen is that a party attacks specifically the arbitration agreement. This has been extended, most recently in the Rent-A-Center decision by the late Justice Antonin Scalia in 2010. And there the court somewhat extended it. I mean, it's really just thinking through the rule, but when there is a delegation clause that may be part of an arbitration agreement, maybe a subpart, but may also be its own clause in a contract, when a delegation agreement exists, a delegation clause saying that certain disputes are supposed to go to arbitration, then it must be that delegation clause that is attacked and not the arbitration agreement as a whole, for example. So this is basically a narrowing down of this rule, and it's somewhat of a rabbit hole, but what it tells us is to keep a dispute from the arbitrators in the presence of an arbitration agreement. The validity of the delegation clause is what matters in the United States. All right, so we talked about competence. We talked about severability. And how do they work together? Well, they really do when in the US we consider arbitrability, right? Is a dispute arbitrable? We go on and we look to the contract, we look to the intent of the parties, and if there's any dispute as to validity, then we look to what is specifically attacked by the parties. What do these two concepts do? They protect arbitration in several ways. For one, they serve to keep an issue in the realm of the arbitrator's powers if arbitrability is contracted for, right? Clear and unmistakable intent must be shown in the US. But if that is done, a dispute is decided by the arbitrators, and it also protects the arbitration from a problem-ridden contract. Let's say there is a good argument for fraudulent inducement. Then this, if the entire contract is concerned, is going to arbitration. So severability protects the integrity of arbitration because the validity of that single clause, often the delegation clause, is independent. That's all from me. If you have any questions, if you want to reach out, please do so. You can follow us, Floyd Zatkovich, as well as zeiler.partners on LinkedIn, on Twitter, and yeah, don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you. Bye.